Well, thank you. And I was thinking coming here, I probably should have called this Designing and Conducting Mixed Method Research, because I'm going to be talking a lot about not just how we designed the large aspirations longitudinal study and what that entailed, but also what happened when we actually tried to do it. And, you know, things happen and it doesn't always go the way that you've planned. So you've got to kind of be prepared for that, unfortunately. So it is going to be I'm not going to talk too much theoretically about design of mixed methods and the different designs. You know, if you want to find out about, you know, a sequential design or a concurrent design, you know, Creswell or one of those books will outline all the possibilities. But when I actually I did look at those to think, well, where actually does the aspiration study fit? And it kind of is sequential, but there's also, because it was a longitudinal study it was also concurrent data collection in lots of ways. So it didn't really fit nicely into one of the categories. But, you know, hopefully if I go into the detail of how we did this and what happened, you know, you can be thinking about, well, how might this apply to what I want to do? You know, what can I get out of this? In particular, how we married the quantitative and qualitative sides of the study so that there was some integration there. So first of all, you know, why mixed method? And again, you can get a lot of information from, you know, research methods books about why this might be a good idea. From my perspective, it really is just allowing you multiple perspectives on the research problem. So you're not just collecting data from one perspective, you're collecting it from many perspectives, and that allows you to understand something in a more complex way. You can see things that you might not see otherwise if you just use one form of data collection. And yeah, it's like having a team of people working together. There are 5 people there. I'll show you the 5 chief investigators on this project in a moment. And we all had complementary skills to bring to this. So, you know, sometimes I think it might be hard to do mixed method if solely on your own. You know, so it's good to seek advice from others who have perhaps got strengths in qualitative if you're more a quantitative person, just so you can fit all those bits together. Okay, so I'm going to be talking mainly about the aspirations longitudinal study, which I did conduct. We collected data from 2012 to 2015, and this was when I was at the University of Newcastle. It was a big project. You can tell that because we've even got a logo, and it took us about so many meetings to get that logo, you can't imagine. But it was an ARC funded large project over 4 years with the Department of Education as our linkage partner. So the people that were involved, these are the chief investigators. Jenny Gore, she started her career as sort of a post-structural feminist critiquer of way back in, I shouldn't say, she's not that old, but and now she actually does randomised control trials. So she's got a broad skill set. She was our lead investigator. James Albright is really an expert in Bourdieu, who we used as part of our theoretical framework. So he brought that to the table, and we've just got a chapter in a book coming out on how to operationalise Bourdieu for research. You know, how do you take that theory and what are the issues with doing that? Erica Southgate, her expertise was really in the qualitative data collection, so the focus groups that we ran and how to get accurate data and how to do that well. And then myself and Max Smith came more from the quantitative side of things. So you can see that the team as a whole, and you know, this is important whenever there's an ARC grant, you've got to show that your team actually has the skills to do the project. And so you can see that we're all coming from different perspectives, and that I think led to you know, a successful project because, well, first of all, successful funding, which is usually the battle, although it did take us 3 goes to get the funding. But also it meant we had the skills to do the job. although even down the track, we then brought in other people in terms of data analysis, a statistician or a couple of statisticians at one point, because the data that we'd collected was a little bit problematic to analyse. Okay, so first of all, a bit about the study, and then I'll talk about our methods and how we went about that. So it was a 4-year project looking at the factors that shape career and educational aspirations of students in the middle years of schooling. And I guess that was the kind of the differentiating point, I suppose, because a lot of studies have looked at kids' career aspirations in the upper years of schooling, not so much in the middle years. So we focused on 10 to 14, but we actually have data from year 3 up to year 12. We were also interested in how socioeconomic status shapes those aspirations in the middle years of schooling, because I think, you know, we all see what you might consider social reproduction in some ways, depending on students' socioeconomic status. And then ultimately to develop some principles for, you know, what do we do with this knowledge? How can we change education and career interventions in schools to help students from disadvantaged backgrounds? So that was the aim of the study. By the way, I don't mind if you ask questions along the way if you've got them as well. Whoops, hang on. Just go.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
With aspirations, the people in the MRAs have just done an assignment where they've had to really dig into a concept and the definition of their concept. So with aspirations, how did you construct that concept that you were investigating?
Okay. Well, I think ultimately we took it from the students' perspective. I mean, we had a really simple of asking the students, and it was their voice, I suppose. But there's lots of ways of understanding aspirations, and in some of the papers we've written, you know, we've referred to different ways of understanding it. So I don't know if I can answer that like we went in with a single concept. I think it's evolved in different papers we've written. We've drawn on different things. For example, Trevor Gale talks about map and tour knowledge that students have, and then Apogee has a different view on those things. So yeah, I don't think we started with a single, we're going to understand it this way. I guess it was a more empirical way. We're going to collect data from students and then have a look at what they've said.
And you've allowed the concept to keep, you've paid attention to it as it's kept moving a little bit through the analysis and so on?
Yeah, definitely. Like I don't know that there's just one way to understand it, I suppose. And given the diversity of the team, we probably all went in with different perspectives on what we were doing. Okay, so this was a bit of a picture of our theoretical framework and how we decided to get an understanding of what factors might influence student aspirations. So the way this diagram's drawn, these are kind of like a dependent variable in the middle. So we're asking students what are their career and educational aspirations in a survey, which I'll get to in a moment. But we were also collecting information in all these spheres. So we use what we called a composite capitals framework. So we use Bourdieu's notions of cultural, social and economic capital. And we thought about, well, if within those ideas, what student level variables could we collect data on, and what school level variables could we collect data on? Because it was kind of a multi-layered project where we've got individual student data, but we were also looking at the schools that they found themselves in and what influence that might have on their aspirations. So looking at it in that frame, we came up with all of these variables, and then we thought, well, how can we measure these things? And some of them were able to be measured in a survey instrument, and the students actually did quite a comprehensive survey. It sort of took one school lesson. And so, ethically, we wrote a lesson plans that went with doing the survey in school. So it wasn't just like the students were there for our benefit. There was a lesson built around it about collecting this sort of data. And in fact, a lot of teachers said it actually prompted conversations because students hadn't been asked a lot of these questions before. They hadn't thought about it. So that's the three top sectors. And then we also looked at the notion of Thomas Becker's notion of human capital. And these are notions around decisions that humans make to decisions, I suppose, to better yourself at schooling, like parents paying for tutoring, for example, is a use of their capital resources. It's similar to the economic capital, but I guess it takes into account, how students are doing at school, that kind of thing already. Whereas Bourdieu's notions are more sort of, it's the idea that you're in this environment and you almost absorb influences without being aware of it, that idea of habitus. So that diagram tries to capture all of the things that we tried to measure, and some of which were in surveys and some were in interviews that we did with parents and teachers, and we did a lot of focus group with students rather than interviews. Yep.
So, sorry, I'm just getting in my head. The difference between the economic capital and the human capital is almost like human capital is active, or you're pushing it for yourself, whereas the economic might be more intrinsic. Well,
possibly, yeah. I see what you're saying. The economic, there's similarities in some ways. This sort of takes more into account, I guess, the individual and the fact that, and we have found some of this, that regardless of SES, students' prior achievement in school is a key factor. So it sort of comes down to an individual who is, not following the social, what's around them. Whereas economic capital, I think from a student perspective, it's often related to their parents' wealth. It's not something they have any control over, whereas, this was more about decisions actually made to try and better yourself. I don't know if that kind of explains it. This framework was used, we didn't develop the idea of the composite capitals, of putting them together, and in fact some people, like Trevor Gale, actually told us once he totally disagrees with this, of matching up Bourdieu and Becker. We did get that from another study, but we actually then had to say, well, how are we going to operationalise that for this project? So that was kind of I guess this guided us in developing the instruments.
So the theoretical model sort of was constructed prior to the instrument. That's really important. And then
Absolutely, yeah. So all of this was part of our grant application and as well. Yeah, so this sort of guided what we wanted to collect. And I'm not saying that we were totally successful in measuring all of those things, to be honest. There's some of those are difficult things to measure. Now, I thought I had the research questions. I hope they're on the... Hang on. No, I must have missed a slide, but anyway, it doesn't matter. All right, so this diagram outlines how we fitted the whole thing together, the quantitative and the qualitative component. So this side represents the quantitative component and this side the qualitative. So we started in 2012 and we recruited students in years 3, 5, 7 and 9. We did that in conjunction with the Department of Education. So they ultimately, at one stage we had about 80 schools. I think in the end we ended up with 64 because schools come in and drop out, and over that time it's messy. Then we attempted to follow these cohorts through. There were issues with that. For example, in the first year, the department decided to restructure, and so one whole region, we were meant to have 3 regions, North Sydney, Hunter and the North Coast, and one whole region, the North Coast, was in turmoil with not a director, and so they just did not come in the first year of the study. So 2013, our second year was, a much bigger sample. But then as you go on and try to follow these, you get schools get tired of the study. Even though we were giving them reports on their survey data and they were getting information back. In every school we had a liaison officer, a teacher who was, it was their job to get the kids into the computer lab to do the online survey, but some are better than others. So this did create problems. There's lots of missing data. So even though we've got a total of about data from 6,500 students, it's in the hundreds how many students that we've actually got 4 surveys. Then there's, I don't know, maybe 800 and something that we have at least 3. Over 1,000 we've got, or it might be 2,000, we've got at least 2 time points. So it creates a really, really messy data set with lots of gaps. But it's just the nature of doing this sort of work. It's never going to be a perfect, and kids are away on the day the survey's done or whatever. The other thing that happened too, oh no, I think that's coming up. I'll come back to that. All right, then our plan was, so teachers and parents also did a survey, although we had not a bad response rate from teachers, but not, it was difficult to get parents to complete the surveys. And in some of the low SES areas, we went back to paper surveys. We seemed to have a bit more response with that than online. So yeah, it was difficult. The idea of starting with these year levels too wasn't an accident. That's because we wanted their baseline NAPLAN data so we could get a measure of their prior achievement there, and then we can also collect that again in this year as well. So the idea then was that in the 2nd and 4th year was when we were going to extract based on the quantitative data, and I'll explain how we did this coming up. Extract the qualitative sample and then conduct the interviews with teachers, parents, focus groups with students, and do that at 2 time points. What actually happened is this proved difficult to sort of get started, and because we had that delay in all those schools entering, we didn't get as much of this done here as we thought, so we actually ended up doing these interviews and focus groups in these 3 years. So, that's just an example of how, the best laid plans just don't often happen in practice. And I will talk about, how we made that sample coming up. So does that make sense, the general structure? The other thing to note is that you actually, because it was a focus in the middle years, even though we've got data from year 3 to year 12, a lot of these middle years double up with the cohort, so most of our data's in that year 5 to 10 sort of group. And this design's actually called an accelerated longitudinal design, because in 4 years you have got data from year 3 to year 12. Now, it's not the same student all the way, but because of the overlaps between the cohorts, you can do some statistical stuff to sort of look at trends from year 3 to year 12. So that was quite useful for some of the analyses that we've done.
So just a quick question. Will
Yep.
the slides go off on views? Because my pictures are not.
I think so.
That would be just available for students enrolled in this subject.
Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, I just always have to be careful that a lot of this is, well, it's kind of owned by Newcastle University technically, so I can't sort of be...
You've got the 4 papers though, remember?
We do, yeah.
Yeah, and there's more coming. Okay, so that map shows where all the schools were. So it was from North Sydney. There was a bunch of, they were all public schools, a bunch of fairly high SES schools. In Newcastle area there was another cluster, and then as you go up the coast there's actually, you know, quite a lot of low SES areas there, high Indigenous populations. In our sample I think we ended up with 6% Indigenous students, and you know the population is 3%, so it's given us quite a good, we've just finished a paper on Indigenous aspirations, so that's coming out. So that's the total survey responses that we had. So it was about 6,500 students, but we ended up with 10,500 surveys from those 6,500, because for quite a lot of them we only have one survey. And then in the final years we had that number of students in focus groups, 60 parents and carers in interviews, and teachers and principals. So I don't know if you can imagine the size of that qualitative data set. It's massive, and so we're still working with that. You know, it's going to take a long time to actually analyse. I don't think we'll ever analyse it in full, whatever that means, because there's so many different ways to look at it. You probably can't see, it's a bit of a screenshot of what the survey looked like for students. So it was just SurveyMonkey. So for example, this is an extract. Do you know what you want to be when you grow up? That's what the question that we asked primary students, whereas for secondary students we asked, what work do you think you'll be doing at age 25, just because it's a bit closer. They actually just answered that in an open box, so it wasn't a drop-down menu, pick from these, or you know, they could put whatever they want in there, which created all sorts of problems because in terms of their spelling, you know, like there's 20 different ways to spell architect, for example. So we actually developed, because this was a resurvey repeated, we had a research assistant who was quite good with coding, and developed a misspelling dictionary that it could look up and replace it with the actual correct spelling so that we could then categorise them in other ways. And it got more complicated than that, because we asked them, we also asked them why you want to do that work. So that was just it's collecting sort of qualitative data through the survey. And since then we've actually been able to code those reasons into categories. So you can kind of turn those reasons into quantitative data if you like, as long as you recognise that you lose some of the information when you do that. But with such a large data set, it allows you to look at it in different ways. But yeah, for students that said they don't know what they want to be, we then asked them, well, do you at least have any thoughts? And they could put 3 more ideas in there, which some of them did. But again, then you've got multiple responses per student. Which one do you pick? It creates all sorts of problems that maybe we didn't think through enough when we designed the survey. Although the survey, we did pilot the survey and it had some changes with about 4 schools. And we used a Delphi process to refine the survey. So that's where you have a panel of experts. So we had teachers, people from the department, because we were really looking, you know, are the questions worded in a way that students of those ages can understand it, you know, because it's kids as young as year 3. And in some of those classes, the teachers did have to read out the question and explain it a little. But certainly going through that Delphi process helped us to refine it. And where possible as well, we used questions from previous surveys that had been conducted like the OECD and other studies where we were able to access them, because then it allows you to compare our results with what's been found before. Okay, the next decision that we made was, once we had the careers category, spelt correctly, we then were able to, there's a standard ANSCO code for almost every career you can think of. There's a book this thick that has codes down to 6-digit levels, there's 4-digit levels, 2-digit. What we were able to do was then match those up, so to classify all of the student responses. And then we used an AUSIO 6 index, which was developed at ANU, but it puts every career on a scale from 0 to 100 in terms of what we'd call occupational prestige. So like surgeon or something like that is about 99 on this scale. I think teachers about 83, and it goes down. So it's kind of a measure of not just, it's a measure of the education you would need and the salary you'll get, and a number of things have gone into that scale, but we didn't develop the scale. And roughly, sorry, yeah.
Is that educational prestige in where it actually sits, like a kind of a measure of what the prestige of that is, or students' perception of that prestige?
No, I think it's designed to be more society's perception of the prestige of those careers.
Cool.
And roughly, the careers that are about 66 up on that scale would require a university degree. The middle third, probably TAFE, like it's a skilled position, and then unskilled would be about 30 something down. Yeah, so we were able then to reduce it to this number. We usually, if kids had put more than one career, we usually took the highest number. So, you have to make decisions like that one way or the other. But that then allows us to look at the data in all sorts of different ways. Okay, so then we had we developed a qualitative sampling frame based on the quantitative surveys, because we wanted to use the information we had from the surveys to make sure that we were interviewing a broad range of students, not just going to a school and saying, give us kids in year 3 or whatever. So we used these 3 variables to get a range of students. So we had, for every student, we had a measure of their NAPLAN results, and the Department of Education helped us there by giving us statewide data so we could put it into quartiles. So, and this achievement too, we made the decision for this part of it to combine their reading and numeracy scores. So it was like a single measure, uber measure if you like, of their achievement. And we were able to put that into quartiles. So if they were in Q1, they were in the top quarter of the state, because we had the statewide data to compare it. So not just the top quarter of our sample, top quarter of the state. We then had the career aspiration number that I just talked about, the 0 to 100, and we put those into tertiles. So basically split it into 3 based on our sample. And then we also had a measure of student socioeconomic status. So, and this was an individual measure, because the department gave us the students' information from the enrolment forms that go to schools. And so on those forms, and I mean, parents could lie about this, I suppose, but on those forms, parents have to tick the category of their career, so professional, trade or whatever. And they also have to put down their highest education level. So, and one of those was on a 7-point scale, one was on a 5-point scale. We reduced them both to a 5-point scale and basically multiplied them together, and you get a score from 0 to 25. So a student that had a score of 25 for SES would have a parent probably with a university degree and a professional job. So, and then it sort of went down from there. And again, the department gave us the statewide data for this. So when we put it into quartiles, it's based on the state data.
Can I ask a question around
Yeah.
this? In the UK, people are using pupil premium as an indicator, or free school meal as an indicator of the poorest students, the students from the poorest families. So it seems, when we've submitted something to a journal where the reviewers are English, they're like, how do you know that these students are from poor backgrounds when we don't have the same sort of measure that they have in the UK? It's been very difficult to
Oh.
So we had a project which was about aspiration, I guess, the qualitative one that in Western Sydney, where the teachers told us this student is from a low SES background, this student is from a high SES background, and we have no idea on what basis the teachers made that decision. Because we don't have a measure, do we, that's free school meals or pupil premium that's unambiguous. I mean, Danielle probably knows more about this, but it's sort of been a bit of a problem when it's come to reviewing, because they say, what are the teachers basing their decision on? But your measure is interesting because it's so career, category of career and highest education. So it's all about, it's not, what about somebody who's a well qualified, well trained, but unemployed?
Yeah, well, I guess they might not score that high because
it's income for the household.
well, that's right. And other measures we looked at combined parents' education, occupation and income, but we didn't have income.
Right, because it's not captured on.
No, they don't ask.
Privacy.
Yeah. So, you've got to compromise. But just to say that this, how every school has a measure of SES,
Yes.
like the ICSIA. When we got our measures and aggregated them by school, it correlated with the ICSIA like 0.9 something. So we were quite happy that, it was a reasonable measure on that basis. Yeah.
So, sorry, I'm just interested in, so between the single parent families and the two parent families, did you just take the parent with the highest education, or did you combine both?
No, we took the parent with the highest.
Highest.
Yeah,
So
we had to make that decision.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Danielle, I'm going to need more.
I was just going to say that typically we tend to only look at the data at a school level,
Yeah.
using those scores, and quite often we use proxies, as you've
Yeah.
described, so sort of recognising that we may not be able to access this information, so we use a proxy instead, such as a teacher's self-report.
Mm.
But the clear advantage you have in this study is your partner was the department.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
once you have that, have the department as your partner, you have access to a lot more detail, whereas typically schools would really not like you getting that individual data.
No.
Whether it be NAPLAN or whether it be
Yeah.
SES scores, they would really find that
Yeah.
quite
What are you doing with
crazy,
that? Yeah.
But because you had the department as your partner, you
Yeah.
were able to get...
It was good. And not to say it was easy to extract it even when they're your official partner. They would delay it for months, so everything would keep getting pushed back. And yeah, so it wasn't until 2016, quite far into that, when the study was technically over, where they gave us the last bit of data we needed, like kids, because we have got, which we haven't really analysed yet, for the Year 12s, we've got their HSC results as well. Okay, so with those three pieces of information, we decided we wanted to make sure that we could interview in focus groups students from every sort of combination of those three. So initially, we split it like this. So we had students with the lowest achievement, they're in the lowest quartile, and their aspiration was low. And then we had every other combination right up to high achieving, high aspiring. And then, so that's 12 different categories, but then we split each cell by SES, and I just didn't draw that because it'd be big, messy. So it's sort of 48 categories that we wanted to make sure that we had, at least, I'd have to go back and look exactly where we ended up, but there's at least one student, but probably more than one in each of those categories, because we had 700 and something students that participated in focus groups. And at the time that was really quite difficult, because we had to say to schools, we want to come and interview this student, this one, and then they'd be away, or, it took quite a lot of time, and we questioned at the time, is it worth the time it's taking to get all of this? But now it is quite useful, because, you can say, well, I want to see what high SES kids who are low achieving and low aspiring, what's going on there? And you can not only look at that data from the quantitative, but you can match it to the qualitative and see if there's any further explanation there, because you get some sense from the quantitative, but the qualitative is where you can really see what the kids are thinking.
What about gender?
We didn't use gender specifically in this, but I think it has turned out, because there are so many students, it's about 50-50. Yeah. But certainly if you had a smaller study, I think gender would be important. So because one of the things we're doing now, because one of the results that's come out is that kids generally aspire to gender stereotypical careers from a very young age. So we're digging out now the students that don't do that. What are the ones do, like the boys that are aspiring to nursing and teaching, what's different about them, and the girls that are aspiring to engineering and technology, how do they speak differently about themselves? Can we identify the factors? So we're trying to investigate that at the moment. So yeah, it was a lot of work, that sampling frame, but it does allow you to clearly link the quantitative and the qualitative. So for those of you that are taking, those two things, the more links you can make between the two parts, the more integrated the study is, and the more you can do with your analysis later. This was just early on. This was just the first year of data we made when the kids wrote their reasons for, like, I want to be this and these are the reasons. We had all these reasons and thinking, what is it? What are we going to do with this? So this was a 1,287 kids' reasons into a word cloud. So these were the words that they used to describe why they wanted the careers that they had chosen. So it's quite interesting to see. So the bigger words obviously appeared more often. Animals was just so many, and particularly young girls want to be vets because they love animals. It drops off a bit as they get older, but it's just such a, but it's interesting, a lot of them have that altruism too. That was more prevalent amongst girls. They want to help someone and, people. There's a few little words up there I like. There's science and maths, very small. Not enough of them. But then we also split some of these, by metropolitan and urban rural. So kids in out of the metropolitan areas and kids in the metropolitan. So which do you think is which? Any guesses? Sometimes it's in the smaller words that you can see differences. I mean, you can see a lot of similarities, which sort of says kids are kids no matter where they live.
I'm going to say the one on the right is metropolitan.
Why?
I said words like driving and things like that.
What's that from?
And I just thought, yeah, it seems more like a metropolitan setting.
But on that one?
Yeah. That's just
Yeah.
Yeah, I go in metropolitan on the Rhine, just country, country.
I think it is actually the other way around. But that, you know, we could do this again with the whole sample. You might see a bit more distinct, but you know, doctor. I don't know if there's a doctor over there.
Making, designing, they're sort of urban words.
Designing certainly is probably more of an urban word.
Oh yeah,
Um,
horses on the right one.
There's horses over there. Yeah.
And there's country there as well.
But, you know, it's similar. There's not a lot of differences, but, you know, and that's about 600 kids in each of those samples.
Are there more trucks and cars on this side?
Could be.
Dad on that. That's really interesting.
The dad, I know. I think that came out, and we have to look at that some more, that that the non-metropolitan kids seem to be more influenced by fathers. But is that, I don't know, are less mothers working in the outside of the home in those situations?
And also the age of the child as well, and the gender of the child, the role that plays.
Yes, yeah. Okay, I'll show you. The next one is split by, it's just year 3 and year 9 from the first year of the study. So which is which?
The one on the right's older, there's no fun left.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I know, look at this. And then it goes to working, you know.
See it developmentally.
Well, maybe they are growing up. And, you know, there's a word over there like business. I don't know if you'd see that over here. Money, yeah, becomes, well, money's here, yeah. I think there's just generally bigger words too, like, yeah.
There's probably more, I mean, it would be interesting to see how dreams, like this vague notion of dreams, becomes more concrete in older kids.
Yeah. Well, we thought we would see more of like that fantasy ideas in the young kids, but they generally gave sensible careers. Like some kid wanted to be king of the world or something, and and there was the occasional older one that wrote, you know, professional hitman, things like that.
So, but did you consider the backgrounds of children as a factor that can affect the
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So we had all their demographic data, although it's not split here. I guess I was just showing this to say, well, as a first look at, if you've got a whole bunch of qualitative data and you're trying to think, you can do this kind of word cloud, and it just shows you, well, you know, what are some themes maybe you could look for, so it can perhaps guide how you look at it. Yeah, and it's just a bit of fun. Okay, so what were our data collection problems? And there were a number. In the first year, we had really poor parent permission response rate, like with the ethics process. We had to get parents, for every child to use their data, we had to get parents to sign and send into the school a permission form, which eventually came to us. And in some areas, and particularly, you know, lower SES schools, that we just weren't getting them back, and it meant we were going to have almost no data from significant parts of that. So even though the way it worked, because there was a lesson plan involved, the teachers took all the kids in the class to do the survey. So all the data was there, but we were only allowed to access from, the department actually got that first. We could only access the ones we had the permission slips from the parents. And it was looking like being really low and dire, and we were thinking, well, this is going to be a disaster. So we went back to the ethics committee and made the argument, can we have an opt-out process? So what that meant is we, instead of sending home the information statements that are very wordy and no one reads. I mean, I don't know, whoever's a parent, I don't like reading those things. We were allowed to make glossy brochures that just explained what it was about in plain English, and there was a slip at the end of it, like, if you don't want your child to participate, send this back. So it was flipping that around, and it took a bit of convincing of the ethics committee, but we made the argument that, the project had a low SES focus, and we just weren't going to hear those voices in the study unless we actually could get the data.
So did you actually reissue that? So you would already reissued the consent form for the opt-in process,
Yep.
and then you reissued another document
Yes.
for the opt-out.
Yeah, and it was just like a trifold glossy brochure, that was just sent home. We also had to put it in school newsletters. Like, we had to convince them that the parents would have multiple ways of seeing the information and opting out if they wanted to. The other thing they made us do too was put a final question on the survey for students that says, do you allow your data to be used in the aspirations study? And some students ticked no. It was like, so that just, and you just had to live with that. It was like, you've just answered the whole thing and then you say no.
That's really interesting. I mean, everybody's got to go through ethics here. So the point that you should even give children, even if their parents have given permission, that children have the right to make a decision about their data, even if they're very young. That's something really important, isn't it? About
Yeah.
ethics. And the other one is the argument about the low SES schools. That's about the beneficence, I think, one of the principles, is it, of the human ethics policies is that you do good with it. So if you're going to compromise the good that the study can do for impoverished families, then you make a different sort of argument. And the other thing, we had to make a change in our project too. So even if you get an ethics approval to do it one way and then it's not quite working out, it's very, very possible and common to go back with an amendment. It's not locked in.
Yeah, and sometimes you just better, even if it delays you a little bit, if it means you're going to get better data to work with, it's worth the effort. I mean, no one likes dealing with ethics committees, it's just tedious, but it's just part, you have to do that. So that was a good outcome. It increased our response rate significantly in the second and subsequent years. So as I said before, not all schools are in the first year of study, so that reduced the number of students that we would have 4 years of data for. I think I said that before, that some schools just got sick of doing it. Maybe, because over the time of 4 years, a lot changes in schools. The principal would change. They'd think, well, why are we doing this? They didn't have different interests. And that was something we had to deal with too, because it was a 4-year study and we were trying to track, kids' aspirations over time. Some schools said, do we have to stop doing everything that we do for kids to improve their aspirations? Because it would be like a complicating factor, but we said, no, just keep doing it. And, if you're doing something a bit different, we can actually take that into account. So when we've looked at, we did a little spin-off study where we looked at 15 low SES schools and how many kids were aspiring to university. And we found in 2 there was significantly more. And then we went and actually we interviewed the principal, like, what's different here? And one of them had, this was just year 11 and 12 kids we were looking at here, and one of them had really nice facilities that sort of mimicked the university space. So and then another was just physically located right next to a university, and the kids were always on campus. So it was that familiarity. So those external factors were important, but we couldn't ask schools to try and all stop doing things for 4 years. That wouldn't be ethical.
Is that one published? Is that?
Yeah, that's called Choosing University, and it was funded by the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education. It's NCSEHE if you Google that. And it's NCSEHE. It should come up, the National Centre, and it's published somewhere on there. I mean, that was another advantage of having such a big study. We were able to leverage a number of further grants that wanted to look at the data in particular ways. Like there was a funding from the National Centre for Vocational Education, and there's a report coming out for that soon about kids' aspirations for TAFE and trades and so on. Big data can be good for that reason, that you can look at it in a lot of different ways. We did find some of the focus group data is variable in quality because, again, with such a big study, we had a team of research assistants doing it, and some people were better at managing a focus group and getting the kids to talk than others, whereas in some you just get one word, you know. So even though we tried to train them, you know, that was just a problem. But, you know, if you're doing a single study yourself, you can at least be consistent in how you do that. And I think I mentioned that before, that the Department of Education data took a long time to extract from them. They always had other priorities. But that's just the problem with dealing with a large department. Now, the papers that I think some of you had access to, but this one was the first one that we published in 2015. But at this stage, when we started writing this, we only had the first 2 years of data, and the first year, as I said, we didn't have as much as we'd wanted. So, and we also, with all the missing data, we were thinking, how are we going to use this? So we just used the 2013 data because it had more. So that paper it's open access, so, but I mean, all of you would have access to the library anyway, but that was sort of the first go we had at sort of analysing the data. So the students in this are in year 4, 6, 8 and 10. And, you know, out of that really came the idea that SES, when you considered it in relation to a whole lot of factors, wasn't as important as some of the others, like prior achievement. So students' school achievement, so even if you're in the lowest socioeconomic status quartile for SES, if your achievement is high, you aspire as highly as anybody else. So it kind of puts the onus, I guess, on schools, that schools can have a big impact. Of course, though, there is also a relationship between SES and achievement. So it's complicated to tease out, but when we did multiple regression, the achievement comes out more strongly as a factor than the SES. The other thing we looked in that paper was occupational certainty, you know, the question about do you know what you want to be as opposed to have you had some thoughts? And we looked at how that changed as well, like whether kids were tentative or were certain about their careers, and there were a few differences there. I'd have to look at it to actually remind what they were. And the other thing we looked at there was the quantitative analysis of the reasons they gave. So, you know, it did come out that more girls were interested in helping people and were motivated in that way. More boys were interested in money and what the job would pay. So there were a few things like that you could read about in that paper.
Can I ask a question about this? I'm just looking at it here now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in like the truth claims and the strengths of findings. So the last sentence of the abstract says, our analyses demonstrate the complexity of students' career aspirations and some of the challenges with this research, thus signalling the need for caution in the development of policy and interventions. So a finding that says, just slow down, it's more complicated than you think, doesn't give an answer in a clear-cut way, but it's a very important thing to speak back to policies.
I think so, because at this time too, there was a lot of emphasis on widening participation, like it's all about low SES kids, we've got to go fix them and get them into university, and it was kind of showing that that's maybe not the most important factor to be looking at. Kind of what's good for all kids is good for all kids. So it was kind of saying it is more complicated than that, because the factors that we looked at in this, and it wasn't everything in the surveys, we selected some factors, only explained about 13% of the variance in the dependent variable. So that means there's a whole lot of other stuff going on in these kids' lives that we didn't measure in the analysis we did here. So yeah, it is basically we don't know yet. Hold on.
I was going to ask it at the end, but you brought it up. Where you said that the girls were more interested in helping people, and then you said you could use this in careers like engineering, so appeal to girls, showing the side of like what engineers do, how they can help people, how
Yes.
development of those careers. Did you get any feedback from schools about like implementing that kind of program? Or?
There have been some little programs like that, I think, to show girls that side of it. So I think there are things happening. It's tricky though, because with another paper is about STEM careers in more detail, but it's tricky as soon as you have, there's a lot of little programs like Girls Can Learn to Code and Tech Girls Are Great and STEM Girl, and in doing that, you're kind of signalling that girls can't do the real STEM, they need special STEM. So it's complicated. Like sometimes it can backfire, but I think there's a role for it, because I think they are making decisions on stereotyped information about what an engineer does. So of those that chose engineering, this is in the STEM paper, I think it was 91% male, and for tech careers like computer science, it was 94% male. So that's a huge, girls are just not interested. And I think they're making decisions, they've just got this idea that that's for boys. Yeah, so I think maybe we do need those girls can do this kind of stuff as a way to try and change it, but I think in the long run, we want to make the whole career, a bit more gender neutral, because you can say girls can do it, but then they, I've walked into SCEM over at the Kingswood campus, where there's a whole bunch of guys in a room. I mean, I think as a girl you think, I don't want to be in there. Like, I can see why girls are thinking that.
It's interesting that importing stereotypes to feminise engineering becomes ridiculous sometimes. So there was a calendar that was put out by the Women in Information Technology group in Australia, I think 2007. We had a study on girls in IT that was longitudinal across 3 states that I was one of the researchers in. And the calendar had, so the girls had told us, well, I don't want to work in software engineering because they're just lonely people sitting in the dark by themselves. But the industry response from the leading group was a calendar which was all these sort of movie scenes with women software engineers in scenes from James Bond movies and that American Beauty in the bath with rose petals and a bodysuit, and it was a bit crazy. It was like this is the wrong strategy. You just look, we can be attractive too. It's importing a stereotypical gender perspective.
Yeah, it is. Well, we've got another variable that gives us the male-female proportion in particular careers in society, and that's what we're using to identify the kids that are not following the gendered patterns. So I don't know whether that'll give us some clues, but it's so persistent that, and usually the careers that are highly feminised are lower paid generally. So if this persists, you're going to have that gender pay gap for quite a long time unless we can turn that around. I don't know how much longer you want me to go or stop. Like the next section sort of looks at some of the other papers and results, but you know, I don't know whether I should keep going or stop for some questions or any questions.
Everyone's got 2 questions by now.
Yeah, I haven't seen how mixed method really plays into account in this one. I mean, I haven't seen numbers that are supported by the qualitative data, for example. You haven't shown it.
Okay. Yeah, probably in, I'm just trying to think what might be, some of the other papers, there's one on kids' aspirations for the military and one on teaching, has a combination of factors. Well, maybe I will keep going and we might see a bit more of how that works. Because some of the papers we really have just focused on the quantitative data, and in some we've used a combination of both. So we've been able, so for example, in the one about careers for the military, we were looking at, well, which kids are aspiring to the military, and then we were able to dig them out from the focus groups and see how they talked about that a bit more, so we were able to match that up. Or, you know, in some of the other analyses, we've been able to, you know, dig out the low SES, high aspiring kids and see how they talk. So we've been sort of focusing on doing the quantitative analysis usually first, seeing what comes out of that that's interesting, and then trying to find those kids in the focus groups to see if we can explain it more. Yeah.
So what you described so far sounds like a sequential design in a way, because you use the quantitative results to identify your participants for the interview. Did you analyse the survey to then decide on the questions to ask in the focus groups, or were they predetermined?
No, it was a predetermined focus group script. I mean, it was semi-structured in that the facilitators are allowed to go off script if they wanted students to expand. But no, everyone was pretty much asked the same. That would be good if we could have done that in some ways.
It's a very large study, so probably hard to do, but when it's a smaller study, a nice way to making sure that there are synergies is to actually use the survey to look at trends almost, and then by doing that analysis first, not only lets you identify your participants who are in those categories, but also, well, that's an interesting finding. You know, you actually have, and then you can always find out more about that, so you can actually shape your questions based on that survey result. I think that helps bring the two methods together.
I think it does, and that if you could do that kind of thing, that would be much better, because often we find something interested in the quantitative, we go to the qualitative, and it's just not, that point isn't really raised. But I don't know how else we could have done it on such a large scale. Yeah. With that choosing uni study that I mentioned, we were able to do that a bit, because what we did was as well as looking at the year 11 and 12 kids from these low SES schools, we also then went and interviewed uni students who had actually got to uni from those schools and asked them to reflect back what, right, I just answered it. We'll count that one. Yeah, so that was kind of more like that. We could actually design the qualitative a bit more closely to follow up on our points, but for this we couldn't do it. So it probably is more that sequential design that the quantitative informed our selection of the qualitative, but not really the content.
What about after, for example, analyzing the quantitative analysis? So, for example, doing the quantitative first, then I have my interviews. What about if I find something interesting, something I want to go back to quantitative to change things? Can I go back to change things, or once I have finished that quantitative, that's it, I can?
Oh, you can certainly go back and analyse it differently once you've got the data.
For example,
Go and do another survey or something, do you mean?
yeah. Or if I
Not usually. Yeah.
So if I finish my
That would be the next study. You know, you'd put that in future research. We'll
Although if
do.
you had, I'm just thinking an action research, I mean, you wouldn't have probably do, but an action research approach where you're redesigning on the way, if you had multiple points in time, you might allow that.
And I've had a PhD student working in an area that was really very new. So we actually did some interviews first to then inform the survey
Right.
and then interviews again. So yeah, so that didn't happen. So sort of like a scoping exercise. What are the big issues here? So I'm going to use that through open-ended sort of interviews and focus groups. Map that out. Okay, these seems to be the main issues in this area. Now I need to build a survey and make sure I'm capturing all of that. Yeah, so it's sort of another addition of the first step if you're working in an area where there isn't a lot of guidance in the literature.
And then pilot that,
Yes.
or use
Yeah.
that Delphi technique. With
Yeah.
research to see if there's something I've missed.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
was just about to ask that, whether you used pilot studies. or
Yeah, we
pilot
piloted it with 4 schools, but really to test whether kids could understand what we're asking, and to get feedback from the teachers about how that went. So we just needed to know, that kids would be able to do the survey. Yep.
Just with the that kind of warning that Suzanne was kind of putting up there in terms of the widening participation, but we know universities are kind of working in this space currently, so there are practitioners in there. What would you advise is the next step, or are there next steps being taken currently to understand this space, get a hold of what we should be doing from OSCS?
I think it's kind of depends on what you're recruiting students for. So in the paper about aspirations for STEM careers, one of the things that's come out of that is we really need to start earlier. Careers education usually is in years 9 and 10. And in STEM, if you've decided, which often happens around late primary, early secondary, that maths isn't for you, you're not a maths person, that myth. If that's been decided, then you're not going to suddenly be able to aspire to a STEM career in year 9 or 10. So our recommendations are to start earlier, and a lot of universities are doing that. Like Newcastle University does have a lot of primary school outreach. They've been bringing primary school kids onto the campus with their parents, and that's been quite successful because the parents look around and go, oh, people look normal here, and so, yeah.
At this university too, we found out in the study we've just done for the Office of Widening Participation, there's more than 50 programs they run. Some of them fast forward in secondary schools, first foot forward in primary schools, and there's an army of UWS students, which was what our interest was, who go out and work with those schools. Some of those were involved in those programs in the same schools when they were students. It's really interesting, but we've got 140 pages. We're trying to grapple with in the report now, so.
So you guys at the data analysis stage of...
Oh,
We've written it up,
Hopefully.
the reports.
Oh, you have?
Report
Yeah.
stage.
Oh, cool.
It's 140 pages.
Oh.
So you're still editing or something, or is
Well,
it
refining, yeah.
refining? Yeah.
Trying to work out the findings.
Yeah.
I know.
The key messages
Overwhelming.
come out of a 140-page document.
Yeah, sometimes the executive summary is the hardest bit. Like, what do you want to emphasise? Because often that's all that gets read in reports. So you've got to really make sure you kind of nail it. But that's difficult.
But one thing that we found, I don't know if this is interesting to all of you, but it was interesting to me at 11 o'clock last night, is that University of Western Sydney University, has graduate attributes. In every learning guide for every subject, there are graduate attributes listed that students are supposed to acquire. They probably are for PhD programs too, that students are supposed to acquire through their academic work in units, and we are claiming that there's this other space of part-time employment where these people who work as student ambassadors are absolutely developing maybe more strongly than inside their courses the graduate attributes that University of Western Sydney values.
Right, in these extra programs.
Yeah, so it doesn't only happen in your subject, it happens in all the many other ways that you might engage with communities, which is very interesting.
That's an interesting finding, I
I think it's an interesting finding for higher up at the university. That
Yeah.
This isn't peripheral, this might be core business.
And that's another example of mixed method research research. We had sort of different cohorts. We did a quant pre and post with current ambassadors, so when they began the year and then at the end to have a look at sort of trends and change. We had alumni, so looking back, developmentally now that you're in the workforce for a number of years, we did the quant survey with them, and then we also did qual interviews with the alumni and then interviews with stakeholders. So we had all those sort of different cohorts all answering the one research question, but from different perspectives, through different lenses, and that's why it's now the challenge to actually synthesise that into an executive summary.
Yeah.
So you've got all different data points and perspectives.
And even which part of the story comes first and has the most priority, and what we thought and what the flaws were, not in the design, but in like gaps in information. We had the notion of proxies that Danielle introduced earlier. We came up with proxies for engagement. Was it engagement with your course? How committed are they to their courses? How many classes have they missed as a proxy?
Oh yeah.
But if they miss a class because they're sick,
Yeah.
that is not yeah.
You're always making assumptions, aren't you?
And how many hours did they do as student ambassadors? Because we had naively assumed they would do as much as they wanted, but actually it depended on how many times they got called. And they said, oh, we'd like to have had more work, but they didn't call us. So our proxy measures, those two, we made mis-assumptions. I don't know, maybe we should have piloted, maybe we wouldn't have had that problem if we'd thought about
There would have been another problem.
There would have been
I know, that's the thing. Yeah. Yeah, that's for your limitations section. Yeah.
So that's always the case too, isn't it? There's no design that is ever perfect.
No.
Do you need to have contingencies at the beginning? Or do they emerge?
I don't know. I think things always are going to arise as you go, and you've just got to think what's the best way to deal with it. And it might mean that's a limitation of the study, or you might find a way around it. But yeah, I don't think you can anticipate everything as much as you would try. Perhaps in a really simple study, like just a survey or whatever, but then there's limited conclusions you can make from just using one instrument as well. So, okay, should I go a bit further, or are there other questions? Or I can stop, whatever.
I have a very general question, not really based on the study, but I'm not very quant. I can say that. I don't really have a good understanding of how we do the stats and things. But so when choosing a research partner, or is that a choice that's more made for you, or do you get to have some, do you get some choice in who you're going to work with, and how do you kind of make sure that pairing?
Oh, you mean as an academic?
As an academic,
yeah.
Sorry, as a general.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You certainly get a choice about who you want to work with, and sometimes that works out, and sometimes it doesn't.
Oh.
That's just people, I think. So, and usually it's around a common interest. So even if you come from different perspectives, it's a common interest. I do think in education we could, we often, I notice when I go to an education conference that people do stick within their little tribes, like a quantitative people here and your post-structuralists and your Bourdieuians over there. And I think we need to break down those barriers a bit more.
Program conferences like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it means you can really go into depth in something, but it also means you're not hearing the other perspectives and what they are. So, it's a choice. No one forces you to do anything. Well, I don't know. That's been my experience. So.
And it's interesting when you put in an ethics proposal as a student, there's a part where it says, "Do you need any other training?" So you don't come with all the skills you need to do a PhD. I'll just do it because I already know how to do it. You acquire all sorts of skills, and there's programs such as the ASPRI courses that people will go and do in survey design. So you want to use surveys. We might not have a bespoke course here that will do that. So to go and do a concentrated week in that, delivered by industry experts that we're associated with. You can go and find extra knowledge, and we have one student we had this group of critical friends around him who just kept consulting him. Like he made up his own little delta.
Yeah.
Study, I think. That happens all the time. So you don't have to be the student like the maths one who says in grade 6, I'm not a maths person. You can keep the skills that you need for the study.
Yeah. So one of the PhD students on this study, Nathan Berger, who's now on staff here. Oh, okay, good. Well, he actually, I haven't got any slides of his stuff, but he taught himself how to use R, which is a free statistics package. He did have a background in IT, so he had some programming skills. And he was able to really do a fairly complex analysis using that accelerated longitudinal design, and he identified 4 what we call latent classes of students on different trajectories from year 3 to 12. 2 of them were sort of high, like one was high sort of increasing, another one was high a bit unstable, and then there were 2 low ones similar. And within each of these, so they're latent classes because there's no variable that describes them. They've sort of come out of the analysis. And then we're looking at, well, what makes each of these latent classes different? And they've got, high achieving people tend to be in the higher ones, but there are low achievers there as well, and there's all SES groups in all categories. So it's like, it's something else that's putting students on this trajectory. So what we've then done is we looked at the focus group data, and we found, because in order to do his analysis, he had to have at least 2 data points for students. So anyone where we just had 1 was thrown out. So it cuts down the numbers you've got to work with. And then we've gone and looked at the focus groups to see who have we got in these latent classes. And I think we've got 17 high and 17 low. So we've had a qualitative research assistant looking at those, and for those that are on persistent low trajectories, what's different about how they talk about their futures compared to those that are on that higher one. So it's kind of like a journey of discovery through the data we're still on.
Can I ask a question about what does it mean in a quantitative sense to clean the data? Because, I'm not a quantitative person, so it's the dirty data, if you like, that sometimes I think, that might be more interesting, the little moments that stand out and are unusual. But then in a quantitative world, you need to clean the data of aberrant stuff.
Usually it just means tidying it up for analysis sort of thing. So you don't usually throw out, outliers. They're all in there and accounted for in the statistical whatever test that you're doing. So cleaning for us with the survey data was converting student misspelled words into a number that we could work with. But then we did other things where we didn't get rid of their words. We looked at everyone who wanted to be a teacher. So that was then, and then we had that as a group. And you might create a new variable that's either teacher or not, or STEM or not. And so cleaning sometimes is just putting in the other variables you might need to analyse it how you want. Just making it manageable, I think. Would that be your...
Yeah, I think so. Looking at categories. It's also about how you deal with missing data as well. Different strategies. I think you can add something.
Oh, sorry.
I just going to explain what that really means.
No,
You already captured. First thing is that you look for missing data. For example, you might have 150 students in your data set, and they have to answer some 28 questions. And you can see student number 26 has the answer to question 5 only, but the rest of the questions are answered. And then the next student has, student number 64 has answered 38 questions but left 3 unanswered. So what do you do with these cases? You cannot delete them, but because if you start deleting these cases, out of 150 you will end up with 10 students who has answered perfectly. So that is one thing, how to deal with the missing data. And then there are many programs available on computer. SPSS can impute the data, looking at the students' other responses, the same students' responses, the computer can generate a data for that particular answer. For example, if you are capturing the interest of this particular student towards science, there are 5 questions and focusing on the same issue. The student has written on 4. But the 5th question, but that is capturing the interest, is the missing one. So the computer can look at, the software can look at the 4 responses and then generate a number, an answer. You know, the student could have possibly, you know, like,
A prediction.
A prediction.
Yeah.
And that is very, it's not just a wild guess, there's a lot of stats behind that. So that will be one, that is one thing, replacing missing data. But there are some guidelines also. You cannot just ask the software to do everything. So there's a percentage, you know, like less than this many other things. So that is one thing. And next thing is that looking for outliers. Outliers means that, for example, sometimes students' answers can be bit wild, you know, kind of. For example, there are 20 students in your sample size, and everyone has answered, you know, if it is a Likert scale, 1 to 6. Others are all giving answers from 1 to 5 only, and one student is writing 6, and you know, max, and that is pretty wild because others are like that. So you are finding out the lowest. You know, everyone has answered from 3 onwards or 2 onwards, and 2 students have got 1. Things like that. So how to deal with that? And sometimes students, you know, you can have wrong entries. Like, what is your age? Students have all written 9 and 10 and 11, but one student hasn't done, or it's an error in that time. 998.
Yeah, you could probably delete that one or yeah, impute something else. Yeah.
Because I used to delete the whole survey if there's something missing.
No, never. You know, you are deleting.
Oh, no, because we had, some students didn't finish, but we could still use their data for what they did. Yeah.
Cleaning it up so it was commensurate.
Yeah, although we didn't impute any data into our missing values because there's so many. So that's when we actually worked with a statistician to come up with techniques that took into account the missingness. And so, you know, because it was tricky. So we thought we need expert help here. So there was a GEE technique for logistic regression that takes into account missing data better than other logistic regression techniques. So sometimes, you do need that help because statisticians understand all of the assumptions under different tests that we didn't have enough knowledge of. So, I don't know to what extent. I mean, a lot of these things only apply probably if you've got a massive data set, I think, with a lot of missing data. If you're doing smaller studies, it's probably a bit more manageable.
And when you designed the study, the survey, I'm interested in, you said you used some questions that were the same as the OECD ones. I've learned from Danielle and Jackie, there's little bunches of questions that come from different validated measures that have been created elsewhere in different instruments. To what extent did you create a novel new survey, and to what extent did you draw on other measures, and how did you find them?
Well, we looked at the literature to start with to see what other instruments had been used a lot. There were others that the Department of Education actually had used, like quality of school life and things like that. The teachers' survey had quite a bit from instruments that the department had already used. So I don't know, I'd have to go and look at the whole survey to see what sort of proportion. Maybe it was half sort of made up, because there were things we tried to add, like, you know how there's standard questions that, like books in the home is sort of a proxy measure sometimes of SES, but we wanted to add things. We think books are becoming less important, now, so we looked at questions around technology and so on. So some of those actually came from, I think, the PISA or TIMS tests. So, you know, there's a lot of things you can draw on, and the good thing about using them is they're usually worded really well, and you know, but then we did come up with other questions. So if we thought we hadn't captured, you know, everything in those circles and we wanted some other things.
Did you have to write and get permission from other?
Not if they're sort of open source and they're out there, you can sort of just use them. Got away with it. Okay, any other questions? Yeah?
Yeah, I have a question concerning mixed method. It is, as I said, that one of the important things with the mixed method is the integration of the two sets of data.
Mm-hmm.
And so in which the data may be consolidated, may be connected, or may be embedded. But I don't know how can we decide which method to integrate? Yeah.
Yeah, I know there's no sort of set way of doing any of this, really. You know, there's so many research methods, and you know, I'm not an expert on a whole stack of them because I haven't used them. So you've really got to be guided by your research questions and think, is the data that I'm collecting going to help me answer those questions? I think that's a key thing to start with. You know, you don't want to be collecting data that's got nothing to do with what it is you're trying to answer, so they'll help you to keep focused. But I think if you do decide to use multiple methods or mixed methods, you need to think from the start how you might connect them. You know, so for example, when we use a quote, usually in a paper, we might have under it, you know, we've got pseudonyms for the student names, but you know, high SES, low aspiring, you know, we can get from the survey a bit more descriptive data that goes, so when you read the quote, you can sort of place that student in a context from the survey. So that's another way of linking the two. I don't know, what sort of methods are you thinking of using, or you're not sure yet?
I'm not sure.
It looks like, I'm just looking at the military one. It looks like, so the analysis has 2 questions. So the subheadings have 2 questions in the body of it. Who aspires to a career in the military? And all that question, who aspires to a career in the military, is answered through numbers. And then the next part, so there's a table there by year level, cohort, and other variables. Then the second section is a different question. Why? So who you can answer with numbers. Why? You've got to find their work. So why do school students aspire to careers in the military? And then the article is organised according to themes that emerge from that qualitative data, like family influence. So that's a very good illustration, I think, of how the two work together. Different sorts of questions are answered by different sorts of data.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, the numbers will get you so far, but they can't usually do the explanation side of it. But they can show you the patterns and the factors that maybe you should be looking at in more detail.
Wow. I have a question.
Yes?
Regarding my think study. If I am sending my survey to some of teachers, same sample, but in different kindergartens, is it enough to only get their feedback and stating their feedbacks in my thesis, writing about what changes I have done for my survey by a piloting study, or do I need to test validity and reliability for my survey? Although I'm using existing survey, so is it enough to only test the validity by getting some feedback, or I have to test?
If it's an existing survey, has it already been validated, like the scales within it
There's some scales I have developed.
that you've developed?
Some sections.
Yeah. It just depends. Ideally, if you can pilot and test your scales and check all of that, then that's good. I mean, but if you've got some that are validated and some that aren't, you can always check that afterwards. For example, some of the things in our survey, well, we check the validity of the scales that we use, but some of them held together better than others once we use the big sample. So I think it's wise if you can, but I don't know, what are others' opinion on that it's absolutely necessary?
Okay, I think it is absolutely necessary to check the validity of the scale, even if it is an established, well-known scale, because student respondents can always interpret in a different way. For example, if there is a scale on anxiety and depression that is well-known, developed, in 2005.
Well, times can change, that's true.
Can change, and people can, for example, if it was developed in America and you are now doing that survey in China or India, people can be interpreting the items. So I think you have to.
I mean, you usually would certainly report it, what you end up with in your thesis.
Yeah.
So.
I'm worried about that. If about the examiners, about if I really need to test the reliability and the validity, or is it enough only to write about their feedbacks I have got from the expert or the small,
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah.
I'm the supervisor.
Yeah. Yeah. You should listen to her.
We have discussed this. So in terms of actually, when you have your full data set, you will absolutely report reliability and validity because you're applying these, even though they're psychometrically sound, it's a new cultural context. Yeah. So you absolutely will report that. I think it's more, when do you do that? Do you do that at pilot stage or do you wait? The problem is if you do it at pilot stage, you need numbers. It's a numbers game. So that's going to be a problem. So all we've really sort of recommended you do at pilot stage is face validity. So face validity is just about, so the Delphi technique is what you use, Maha, is sort of saying, look, does this look like, to people that would know, who are in Saudi Arabia, for instance, just to check the face validity. Do you think it would be relevant? Is it easy to understand? Those sorts of things for the pilot stage. But yeah, when you have your full data set,
it has to be.
The psychometrically sound, measures, plus all the new ones. The first thing we'll do is a chapter, the first results chapter, will be psychometric properties of those measures. And that's hope.
Yeah, I know.
That's why we've made sure we've embedded some previously well-researched, well-validated scales, and then some new ones that you wanted to look at as well.
and actually
I mean, sometimes you might even have to remove items and things like that. So it could be that you take one item out and then it holds together.
And that's a problem because through the Delphi, we had many before we came. Part of the response that Maha has got from the Delphi technique is that the survey too long.
Yes.
And so we have cut it back a bit, but the problem is if you make the survey too short, you need some safety net.
Yeah.
You actually might not use all the data you've collected. So you want to make sure that you've got enough there that if something doesn't stand up, you still have data.
Yes.
So it's that fine line between you don't want the participant to be tired and not answer too long, but you need enough in it that you do salvage
So
something.
how to solve this problem? Because I'm dealing with a questionnaire and it's an open-ended questionnaire. I have like 20 items where I want them to write down the responses. So I'm afraid I won't have a high response rate. So how can I deal with this? What are the...
It's just a compromise, I think. It's a compromise between length that you're asking them to do and the information that
If they're all
you can get.
why don't you do it as an interview?
because this is in pragmatics we do this is
Okay.
that.
Okay, all right.
This is
the
the
nature of the
Yeah.
discipline. Okay.
Yeah, so how long would it take to complete?
It's like 10, maybe 20 minutes to 30 minutes, but because some students, they didn't take this seriously, they sometimes they miss questions, and for example, in my thesis, my master thesis, I used to delete many questionnaires because, for example, the last 3 questions, they get rid of,
So ordering, make sure you put your important questions first.
Yes.
That sounds silly.
Yeah.
But the must-have, go first, because otherwise they might then
Yeah.
taper off at the end.
Mm.
So ordering's important, piloting is important to see what is their tolerance for length.
Yes.
When do you lose
Yeah.
people? And then what can you lose, I guess, if you have to lose something.
And with like Survey Monkey or one of the, if it's online, you can force, you can't proceed till you've answered it in some way, like you can force them to do it. And you can also have something that indicates how close they're getting to the end. Like people like to know, oh, how long is this going to take? Like, oh, okay, I've only got that much to go, I'll keep going.
And
Yeah.
you can use incentives. So one of the variations we did in ours, because we didn't have enough of a response rate from the current students at the poster point, we went back to the ethics committee and asked for a variation that we could give them a $25 shopping voucher.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, there's all sorts of small incentives. And the ethics committees will approve them if they're modest and they make sense. Reimbursing people for their time was how we did it.
How we framed it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you need to get to the end of the survey before you can put in the detail that will link up to the incentive.
Mm.
Yeah, a gift voucher for the UWS Connect coffee shop.
Yes.
That'll excite people. I know.
Sometimes it doesn't take much.
I think this has been a masterclass in mixed method design.
Oh, I think everyone's contributed, so it's been great.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Yes.
Can I ask a silly question?
I'm
here?
sure it's no silly question.
It's about this mixed method paper. I'm talking about journal articles, not PhD or
Mm.
major studies like you have done. If it's a paper with two components, like quantitative part and qualitative part, and of course they are related,
Mm.
but not that digging deep into the question, like they are not complementary or something. Would you still call it mixed method research?
Like you're saying they're separate, aren't they?
are, it's from the same questionnaire, so naturally you're talking about the same issue.
Mm.
So there is quantitative analysis, and then we are looking at the open-ended responses of students. Naturally, they are related, issue.
Yeah.
But not necessarily answering the questions,
The same question.
Same question, what do you call it? What do you call that paper?
I don't know, because usually with a journal article, you've got to have, it's around one issue. Although I think in some psych papers, I often read where they do a series of little experiments. You might have read more of those, like it sort of builds. But again, they're all focused on one thing. So I think you'd have to be able to tie them together somehow for a journal article, because you've got to have a point to a journal article. So as long as they're both related and contributing to the conclusions somehow.
The problem or the question of the paper.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think if it looked like two different papers, you'd get that feedback, split it into two different papers.
So if it is just some descriptive analysis and then a qualitative discussion, it's not mixed methods.
Again, well, it could be if the discussion is linked to the descriptive quant. So it's a hard question to answer without really seeing it. Yeah.
Right. Because I know qualitative papers and quantitative papers and this combination of both. Where do you draw the line in the mixed method study or not?
I think it's just depends on the point of the paper. Like Suzanne pointed out with this one about military careers, which was published in Armed Forces and Society, which I never thought I'd publish in. That, you know, it was all about, you know, we had to tie it together. So even though it has a quantitative section and a qualitative section, they're all about, you know, who's aspiring to the military and why. Like that's the central, I guess, issue that we're trying to investigate. And they're quite this journal actually gave more detailed feedback and wanted more changes than almost any other journal we've published in. They were really particular. And we had a quote in the, you know how sometimes journal articles have a quote in the heading? We had it, to serve my country and blow stuff up, because that was one of the things that a boy actually said, because we were talking about the masculinity issue, but they didn't like that heading, so we had to change that. It's too controversial. Yeah. So yeah, I'd just say think about the point of the paper. Sometimes it helps actually to write an abstract first. I find at least writing a draft abstract kind of directs you and keeps you on track.
And also about the proportion of of this data, like quantitative and when you look at the qualitative part, is there any sample size or response size you have to? Yeah. I think sample size is less important for qualitative. Yeah. How many still? You know, like 5 responses, or I'm talking about a journal.
It depends how long's a piece of string. There's no answer to that, because I've seen some really good papers that are focused on 2 students or as case studies, you know, like there's no answer really. But I have a look at other papers that have been written. Okay. But I mean, have a look at, in your area, whatever it is you're studying, have a look at literature and see if there are other papers like that, so you can see what they did. Okay, how are we going? We're out of time, I think. Yeah.
Sorry. I think we need to go. Thank you so much, Kath. I think that was incredibly interesting. And
Thank you.
everybody's